Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
You too. You too. I think it's been over 3 years since the first
Was
one.
it? Wow.
Yeah, I saw the thumbnail and my hair was kind of around here, so a passage of time. Yeah, and I guess just so people are aware, to say that, yeah, what this came out of, I think I got in touch with you because there was a lot being discussed around person-centered and pluralism. There was articles, there was the therapy today about Rogers still being relevant. So it felt like there was a lot around, maybe more than usual. And so yeah, for me, that led me to say like, okay, it's time for part two, and to have some space to
Yeah.
discuss that. Yeah,
Yeah. Great.
yeah. And I think, yeah, as I was saying to you before, I think what might be a good place to start is to get a sense of your journey with PCA and then how that's kind of come into the development of
Yeah.
pluralism.
Yeah. I think it's a really good starting point. Um, I mean, in terms of training, so in the early 90s, I started doing a certificate in counseling skills, which was person-centered slash existential, but it was mainly person-centered. It was a large group. But I think before that, probably my journey started before that, in the sense of when I was an undergraduate and doing psychology as a student, I read Rogers on becoming a person and absolutely loved that, absolutely loved and really resonated with probably the ideas about kind of development and the sense of becoming yourself and authenticity. I did some therapy groups at the time, and I think that idea of being who you truly are was really compelling to me as a young man, and thinking about what does that mean, and who am I, and what kind of person am I, and what does it mean to be kind of who you want to be in the world. So
And sorry, just
yeah,
to jump in there, because I want to catch these things while they're there.
yeah, of course,
Did
of course.
that feel like an exclusive thing to person-centered around that like authenticity or the appeal of that? Or was it just this general sense?
I think I was probably more aware of Rogers. I certainly hadn't been doing much reading about person-centered therapy per se. I did a lot of reading around Rogers but more probably the psychology, because it was a psychology degree. So it was probably more the psychology of Rogers and the idea of growth and actualization, on becoming a person. I mean, I think I read that pretty much cover to cover. But yeah, no, it wasn't so much in the context of person-centered therapy. I did some therapies, did a bit of co-counseling, had a bit of psychodynamic therapy, and then did this course, which was kind of a mixture of person-centered existential. And it was quite an idiosyncratic course. I mean, it was a group of us of about 70 to begin with. It got down to about 40. But it was about 70 of us in a room together, just completely processed, no structure. We spent the first term working out who the facilitators were, and the second and third term working out when we were going to have the lunch breaks. And, it was all completely processed. And I had really mixed feelings about that. I love the excitement and the energy of it. I kind of worried that I wasn't actually learning any counseling skills. And I kind of felt like I was doing a PhD at the time, and I felt like I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was kind of going through quite a crisis that I've written a bit about around my PhD. Um, but wanted to have something to go out and do. So I thought it'd be useful to have counseling skills as well. So after a year of that, I thought I'm going to take a break. I tried to do Gestalt therapy training actually. Tried to get in the second year, couldn't get in the second year, they didn't want me, and ended up kind of falling into an existential training. More because it was just there than I was particularly interested in it. And, I went along, did an interview, thought I'll give it a go and started. So I was kind of, I guess, familiar with person-centered at that time. I mean, my basic training wasn't, apart from that first year, I then did 4 years as counseling psychotherapy in the existential field. And then I was teaching on a course at Brighton Uni, which was, I think, kind of integrative. And no, actually, it was, oh, what's his name? Egan. It was an Egan model. But I was quite keen for it to become more person-centered. And I think I felt the person-centered foundations were stronger. And I like the existential model. I guess I saw myself as an existential therapist more than a person-centered therapist. but like the person-centered a lot. And I think then kind of moved more into the person-centered field when I went to Strathclyde. So worked with Dave Mearns and the person-centered community there, and became involved in the kind of international person-centered world and what was going on at that international level, and taught on the person-centered course.
Can I
Um,
just, I
yeah,
just want to jump in there again because the sense I get is like it's never gone away, that person-centered bit in you in some way. Like there's always been this like, I don't know, being curious about it or seeing some of its value in it, and then kind of going in a more existential route. And I guess I'm interested then to particularly end up at Strathclyde because that feels such a, at that time particularly, a
yeah,
mecca of kind of person-centered
yeah, it
counseling. So
was.
to go from a existential course to a
Yeah.
person-centered role, like what was that for you?
I mean, it it wasn't primarily about the. No, actually, I did want to go. You know what, Chris? I did want to go somewhere that was more person-centered. The course in Brighton was integrative, and I liked it, but I did actually want to go somewhere more person-centered. And I think I it did the clarity and the yeah the clarity of it really appealed to me, and I think also the depth and the kind of relational depth, not as in relational depth, but just the depth of relating. It felt compared with Egan, I really liked that. Um, I guess, in my existential training, my main teacher was Spinelli, Ernesto Spinelli, who was very relational and was also very much about his basis was about kind of not knowing and coming into therapy from a position of not knowing. So that kind of went very well, I thought, with a kind of more person-centered kind of classical approach. And I think I was drawn to that. But I think I guess what I'm thinking, Chris, is you're asking me this, and as I'm thinking about some of the dialogues and debates in relation to pluralism, how much was I drawn towards Rogers and the theory and the psychology, and how much was it actually drawn towards the principle of non-directivity? And I do think it was also something. I think it was something about non-directivity. I mean, it was the political aspect as well. I think a person-centered. Like I found the existential world very apolitical. I mean, and it doesn't need to be, but certainly in, like in Sartre and Camus, there was a real political side to it. But in others like Heidegger, it was much more to the right. But I found the existential world quite kind of apolitical, private practice. To some extent, even like the focus on choice and free will became kind of almost kind of fitted into a kind of neoliberal worldview if you are who you make yourself. Whereas I felt like the person-centered relational side, and certainly as I met it up in Strathclyde, did have that more kind of social political element, and that appealed to me. And with people like Pete Saunders and working on the book politicizing the person-centered approach, I found more of the political dimension. And I guess also because in the person-centered world there was such a focus on empowerment and empowering clients, and that was all. I think that was the bit, Chris, rather than maybe person-centered Rogers per se. It was what I saw in Rogers was about empowering, about equal relationships, about coming from a place of humility. It was the values, I think, that really made, and that's what I didn't really see that anywhere else in the therapeutic world. Those values
Yeah,
about really valuing and respecting the people we work with.
that makes a lot of sense. So it might not be the kind of swallowing the theory whole in a sense, but like you say, the values, the attitudes that underpin it, and Rogers as well. So it was almost like it was alive and in there,
Yeah.
but it might not be the kind of point by point theoretical framework that person centered gives.
Yeah. I mean, when I got to Strathclyde, so this was about 2003. And there was a lot I really loved. And I mean, actually, where I teach now, the main module that I teach on is still person-centered and experiential theory and practice. And I love it. I love teaching that module. And I really enjoy working with students, and still really value that approach. And then that's in the first year, and then they do psychodynamic and CBT. So I still feel really attached. Um, but so I got to Strathclyde and I felt very much at home. I love the international world. I love people around it like Pete Saunders and Dave Mearns. And there was a real energy. I mean, I love the energy and the buzz and the sense of development. And what was going on in the person-centered field. It was really, really exciting. Um, and I was writing about the existential approach and how existential could come into person-centered therapy. I was working with Dave around relational depth and bringing in ideas around dialogue and Martin Buber and bringing that in. I was working with Pete Sanders and Suzanne Keyes and others around the political side and working on the handbook. We started working on a handbook of person-centered therapy as well. So I felt really alive, really energetic, and yeah, I really loved it. And but there was also something about there was one aspect of it that I did find difficult, and that was just I did find in some areas it was just a bit closed, I think. And I mean, and that wasn't particular. I mean, that's not only in the person-centered world. So that's in the existential world. That was something part of the reason I kind of left that world. I think, or didn't stay in that world, is that I just felt this kind of dogmatic existentialism is right, existentialism the truth, existentialism is how things are, and particularly, like if you want to live a good life, you got to live it the existential way. And part of me was like,
Right.
what the,
Yeah.
it's like, isn't existentialism about kind of choice, respect, unknowing? How can you say on the one hand that, working as a therapist is all about unknowing? And on the other hand, it's all about, you got to do this and you got to stand up and be courageous. Just seemed, so I really reacted against that bit of the existential world. And I can also, in the dialogues that and in the arguments and debates that happen, I can also see it goes back a long way from me coming from parents who, my dad, nice man in many ways, but very adamant about his politics, very left wing, kind of an old style Marxist in many ways. And there was a kind of closed mindedness and a dogma there. So I have spent a lot of time in therapy thinking about, what is it about kind of dogmatic positions that gets to me? Something,
Yeah.
I
Yeah, that
know that
makes
it's a
sense.
personal thing. Like a lot of people just let that go. But I think there was something in the person-centered world that really, really got to me.
That
And
was a different level. Like dogma is a thing, but it's like there's really something there with person-centered.
I didn't know, no, it was the dogma that really got, I mean, it was, and that's why I say I'm sure there's some of my own personal stuff in there. I'm sure there is. That was just something about, I really hate at a personal level. Maybe it's something about people telling me what to do. Maybe it's about people saying, I think it's because I think I'm quite a compliant person. And I think I take things on quite easily. And I think that if people say this is right, I tend to believe it. And then part of me goes, I think if I felt very powerful and very confident and just, I'm right in this, it wouldn't bother me. But I think the personal bit is something about feeling a bit vulnerable or a bit kind of permeable. I think I'm quite permeable. And that means that I can take things on, and there's personal stuff again in my family about being the youngest boy and, four older sisters and taking on lots of kind of values and beliefs that, at some level, I kind of wish I'd pushed back more. So I think, again, I'm sure there's a lot of personal stuff in there. But there was something in the person-centered world that really, really upset and annoyed me. And the one that, the thing that I remember most and is most clear is seeing on the course, like a student get really attacked for getting it wrong, for asking a question, for saying the wrong thing. And I felt like there was maybe I didn't feel relaxed. It felt like there was a way of being that was a right way of being. And it felt like people couldn't acknowledge that. And there was something about that contradiction between, um, be who you are, but, being who you are means being like this. And if you're not like that, then you're not being who you are. There's something about that that just drives me fucking crazy. You know, I don't know, maybe
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
me. There's something about that, about, like, I really want you to help you be you are. And if you are like, and it's not just in, I used to do, you know, the five rhythms where you do the
Yes, yeah, yeah.
dancing? I mean, I
Mm.
left that. Because I couldn't bear this thing about it's all about authentic dance and authentic movement. But if you're authentic, you'll do this movement and that movement and that movement and that movement. And then I remember kind of getting told off, that wasn't my, and it's like, fuck off. It's like,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, like, don't tell me what it means for me to be authentic. There's something about that, Chris, really, really gets to me.
And it's the what I hear is the combination of those. Like, there's one thing in being told to be a certain way, but it's like particularly when that is paired with authenticity,
I think when it's
when you're
somebody's,
getting both messages.
yeah, I think it's somebody saying, you know, I know you really want this. It's like, you know, when I'm having a fight argument with a partner or something, and they say to me, you know, I know what's, you know, you really want this. It's like, no, I'll tell you what I want. I'll tell you what I want. You know, if I want something, I'll say it. Please don't think, you know, it's about people getting in your mind or something like that.
I find that
Deep
so
breath.
curious in a yeah. I find that example so curious in a therapeutic perspective because that is so much of what we're talking about directivity, right? In terms of people
Yeah.
saying this is what you want, or this might help you, or this is what you need. Maybe we'll come back to that later, but it just really
Yeah.
struck me there of something of that. It really captures what you were saying there, I think, about that I guess a power dynamic that's in any relationship and
Yeah.
how that is expressed.
Yeah, and there's something about that power being compounded when you're actually saying, look, I'm not, you know, I'm not being powerful. This is completely about you. But this is, you know, there's something even more kind of oppressive about the silence. You know, it's like in Brighton, you know, like if you were naturally in touch with your dietary wants, you'd be eating brown rice and you wouldn't want sugar, and you know, that kind of ideology that of people telling others what it is that they naturally want. And I think I've always kind of really reacted against that, and
Yeah,
found that really insidious, I think. But I totally accept that's probably just me as well. You know, that is, you know, there's personal process in there as well.
I get that. But if I understand right from some of the things that you challenge in within therapy and things as well, is that there's a representation of that kind of theoretically too. So like you can notice and own the personal part in it, but it is also happening in approaches as well, just in kind of in its own right, and that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens in all approaches. I think it happens in psychodynamic approaches. There's a particular way of being. I mean, like I said, I tried to do was thinking about doing Gestalt training, and one of the things that really put me off is that I went along to some of the trainings, and I just found it. I found a kind of demonstration that I found it quite brutal, but it was kind of brutal in a way that was kind of not acknowledge the brutality was not like people were getting really hurt, but it was like this is good for you or this is how it's supposed to be. I remember one thing that happened to me is that I was in a group and it was at the end of the day and people were tired and it was you know, people were really encouraging me to talk and then the facilitators. And then when I did talk, I got this really kind of hard time for kind of like taking space. And it just felt, I don't know, I just felt really manipulated by it. And so there's
Yeah, I
something
really
about
get that.
therapies, you know, I think therapies in different ways can be I mean, because I just did an interview with somebody for a magazine who was talking about bullying in the therapeutic world. I mean, you know, I acknowledge some of my stuff, but I think there is also reality there that I don't know what your experience is, but certainly my experience is that people do experience, you know, bullying and they experience being manipulated and they experience really unpleasant things in the therapy training world. And we don't really talk
Yeah.
about that, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I think going back to that idea of power, I think wherever power is present, which is basically everywhere and in every relationship, there is always that risk, and maybe
Yeah.
even say the presence of things like bullying and manipulation,
Yeah.
just because of that power dynamic. And I guess primarily how the person in power or the majority of power holds that for themselves as well. And then if it is used against people or they are protecting themselves or something, I just think with power comes bullying often,
Can
I
do.
think.
And not
Can
maybe,
do.
you know,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think intentionally, and I don't think always I mean, maybe sometimes intentionally, but I think it's easy to underestimate how much power we have and that people can feel kind of affected, manipulated, you know, that they have to do stuff, even if it's not something that we kind of intend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe I think just thinking about that, maybe I misrepresented that in some way, that it's not like it's always the case that it's there, if that makes sense. Just that power precedes those things when they
Yeah.
happen, just to
I mean,
correct that.
yeah,
And I was just going to say quickly about the I think about the training aspect is very difficult around that as well, because I know we can notice it with our students and on other courses as well, is this very difficult thing of when there are standards and conditions, in terms of qualification, in terms of where you need to be, and that really difficult balance between trying to offer the conditions, particularly in a person-centered course, and facilitate that space, and at the same time saying, and you need to do this by this time.
Yeah.
So that sets up a difficult dynamic as well with those alongside each other, I think.
Yeah, it really does. It really does, Chris. And I think for me, part of the answer to that is around transparency. And like, on our training course, we have standards and students have to meet standards to go on. And, I try and be really explicit about and really clear about, what the standards are and also to kind of acknowledge that then these standards aren't absolute. It's not that, you have to get like 60 or something, and that's the university regulations. And I try and be transparent about that's the university regulations, that's the framework we're working within. Doesn't mean it's the kind of necessarily the right thing. It might be the best thing that we think and the best thing that we can set up, but there's also acknowledgement that it can always be improved. Um, and I think that's, going back to the person-centered field, I think that if somebody says, like, I really believe in person-centered therapy, this is my worldview, the core conditions I think are necessary and sufficient for change. I think those things are just so valuable. And I really, that it really don't have a problem with that. But there's something about when that gets absolutized and it's like, and that these are absolute truths, you know, these are the conditions. And then if you disagree with that, I mean, this is what I hate in the therapy world sometimes, that if you disagree with that, then you get pathologized. And that happened, when I was a kid in psychodynamic therapy, when I would challenge the psychodynamic therapist, it was like, and I wonder what's that about, where's that anger coming from? And I'd hate to think
Yeah.
that in the person-centered world, that where people challenge it, it's seen as a problem. And I think one of the issues is how much does that happen? And I think people are a bit pissed off with me, for want of a better word, because it feels like I'm kind of flagging these issues and maybe over-representing how much it happens. And people are going, well, wait a minute, why are you attacking the person-centered world? And maybe that's a
Yeah.
fair criticism, but I think it does happen. And
I know.
I feel mixed. On the one hand, I think it's important that we kind of whistle blow, we talk about these things, we acknowledge these things. Like you say, there's power everywhere. Of course, it's going to happen. I don't think it happens more in the person-centered world, but I guess that's a world I've been more involved in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I've got lots of threads and like angles I want to go, so I'm just trying to work out which one to go in. But seeing as what you'd said there about person-centered is what you've been more involved in, maybe that, and we can maybe loop back round to what we were just talking about, but maybe that answers something of the pairing of pluralism and person-centered, because I guess that is a curiosity for me in terms of um, putting them together in a
Yeah,
sense, and also the criticisms that you just spoke about there.
yeah.
You said why they're there and where they're coming from, but something about why go via person-centered, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, and
Yeah,
why
interesting.
person-centered particularly, as opposed to pluralism in its own right and separate.
So let me talk. I'm going to let my talking of power. I'm going to let my cat out. It's very powerful, my cat.
Yeah,
She's
got
very
a hold
powerful.
over you.
Sorry, she's got Amsterdam.
Got yeah,
So yeah, no, that's a really good question. And so to talk a little bit about that. When so I was working with Dave and working in this person-centered world. And then I started working with John McLeod as well, and we had some meetings, and he was setting up a clinic. And John comes from a more narrative background, narrative therapies. I mean, he was also trained by Dave and was involved in that world and the person-centered world. But I think as a narrative, because of the research side, because of the a bit more postmodern, he was always a bit outside of it. I think he would have described himself in the like early 2000s as a narrative therapist. So he was setting up a clinic and we were talking about, what kind of therapy he might, and I wanted to be involved in it because of the research. And so we had a research thing. And we were kind of talking about what the therapy might look like. And we kind of talked about, I think because we're both quite involved in research, we talked about it having a kind of common relational basis. I think we both felt that sometimes techniques could perhaps be helpful in some of the narrative stuff. I think we were both very interested in the idea of kind of client resources and client empowerment. I think we both felt that a purist person-centered approach, classical person-centered approach, wouldn't be quite right, given the kind of his training, which wasn't person-centered. So it was, I think it was more integrative or more, yeah, I think it was more of an integrative training. So a clinic based in where he was working. So it's kind of I mean, like a lot of these things, Chris, it was less kind of well thought through theory and more just pragmatic decisions. And then we talked about it, and then we came up with this word pluralistic to kind of represent the idea of there being kind of different ways of working with people. And I think at the time we saw it as something not totally separate. I don't think we actually thought that much about how does this relate to person centered because it was kind of located where John was working in this different, I would say at the time it wasn't particularly person centered base. And then what happened is that I then thought, I think because I was very involved in the person-centered world still, I thought it'd be interesting to write about kind of person-centered pluralism and to think about pluralism. And we wrote the paper for the person-centered journal, which I think I was still an editor on at the time, or yeah, I think it was around the time I was one of the editors. And I think I think the relationship between person-centered and pluralism is complex. So there's different ways into it and at different levels. So a one part of me and it's so dependent on how we understand what is person-centered, and I think that is really key. And there's different understandings. And again, I don't think that's just me. I think sometimes I feel that pluralism articulates the real essence of what person-centered is or should be or could be about. I sometimes feel like pluralism really articulates Rogers's vision, and that actually, at the end of the day, many people in the person-centered world do tend to see things in a pluralistic way.
Mm.
And I guess then there's a question of actually whether it's useful to have the term pluralistic there or not, or is it actually just implicit? So then that's another kind of line of thought. At other times, I think that actually person-centered and pluralism is something quite different from person-centered, particularly as understood in a more classical sense. And actually, it's kind of trying to take a space that isn't its and should just kind of bugger off, for want of a better way of putting
Right,
it. And
right.
actually, it's not helpful tying the two together. So that's at one level of that. And then I think at the other level, there's also something about pluralism. Within pluralism, there's the possibility of drawing on person-centered practices, which so it's kind of a bit of a sandwich, really. I mean, one way of looking at it is you got kind of like these pluralistic foundations as a theory, and then there's a question about a person-centered theory. Does that sit on top of that or not? And then you got person-centered practice and pluralistic practice. One of the things which I remember somebody saying, I can't remember who it was, saying maybe this overcomplicates it, but I think in some of the debates gets missed, is that when we talked about pluralism, we talked about it both as a practice and as a philosophy. And I think that they are kind of distinctive. And a pluralistic philosophy doesn't mean you have to practice in an integrative way. It just means valuing that there's different ways of helping different clients at different points in time, and that it's collaborative and it's a kind of pluralistic philosophical stance. So I think sometimes when people say pluralism is about being integrative, it doesn't necessarily mean integrating practices. It could just be that kind of belief, but you could still say, right, I just practice in a purist way. But I tend to think that I I'd like to think that pluralism articulates the essence of a Rogerian philosophy. I do kind of think that, Chris.
Yeah, okay. I guess that's what I wanted to ask a bit more
Yeah,
about because in some ways, in one representation of it, what I think I'm hearing you say is something that maybe pluralism represents this potentially like more wholly than some person-centered practices at the moment. I don't know if it's something like that. And if so, I don't know if you can speak a bit about what
yeah.
it is about pluralism that you feel captures Roger's view.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like I mean just to I will do that, but just to say, I feel, when you say pluralism captures some elements more than other person-centered approaches, I just feel really ambivalent about that because on the one hand, I think, yeah, And I think that things like where you've got a really kind of adamant, hard line, kind of closed-minded person-centeredness, I don't think that's person-centered. But then part of me thinks like, without humility again, is like saying, well, who might say what is person-centered or not? So I feel quite torn on that. But, if I was to say, I think what I read in Rogers, okay, and maybe this goes back to what I first read in Rogers on becoming a person, is that development is something about being fluid. It's about being open-minded. It's about not having fixed or rigid ways of seeing things. It's about allowing our conceptions of the world to be fitted to the world as it evolves and as it changes. And that Rogers in 61 talks about the way that a lot of us have kind of fixed self-concepts, fixed black and white beliefs. This is good, that's bad. And these kind of and growth and development is about moving from that position, as it is actually in most of the therapies, is moving from a kind of position of fixed black and white to something that is more fluid. So that we see, and that involves a lot of self-challenge. That involves kind of challenging ourselves, constantly allowing ourselves to being open to something new. I'm recognizing that things are different, recognizing that things are nuanced and subtle, recognizing that there is no good or bad often, and that that there's a kind of constantly evolving, changing world. And for me, that's what pluralism is about pluralism articulates that belief that there is not one objective truth. Because I think that's what Roger's saying, is they're saying that development is about recognizing there isn't one objective truth. It's about recognizing the evolution and the flow and being open to it and challenging ourselves really deeply to be open to that flow of being
Mhm.
as a flowing process rather than as a fixed construction.
Right, yeah. So let me just see if I've got that right. Is that at one end of the scale, the kind of person-centered side is the kind of fixed, rigid person-centered beliefs or practitioner, and in its own right may go against what Rogers is saying there that you represent. And so to introduce something like pluralism, which talks of or is a kind of like evolution maybe, and speaks of like variety and change and adapting to clients, that actually that is connecting more with Roger's idea of evolution and change and development than, I mean, anything that is fixed, but particularly a fixed person-centered practice. Is that accurate? Have I kind of
Yeah,
got
I
that
think
right?
so. I mean, there's one question there about how much am I imagining that there are these kind of fixed, rigid, person-centered people in the world, and in a sense, maybe that's just an empirical question. Um, and I can see why people experience that as critical. And that's maybe something for me to look at. But yeah, I think that, and it's not, I mean, I certainly don't think, when talking to you or lots of person-centered colleagues, I certainly don't think that, every person-centered person is fixed and rigid and doesn't see, there's clearly a lot of openness and fluidity in the person-centered world, and it's very special and important. Um, and it's pluralism. I would say that pluralism is an articulation, maybe more than an evolution. It's an articulation of a particular way of reading Rogers, which is based around the idea that growth is about being open to the fluidity of being, and which is a very common idea in the existential world as well. I mean, it's very key to a lot of existential thought as well, that being is this process, existence is a process. But we can, I mean, Spinelli talks about sedimentation and the way that we can become sedimented in particular views and particular constructs. And that to be authentic, to be genuine, is something about to be in flow with the ever evolving experiencing and not being defensive. Um, yeah. So I think that's right. I think that's what you're saying is that, and that particularly links to research, I think, in the sense that that openness, when we talk about questions like what works in therapy and what is helpful in therapy, that openness means something about being open to what evidence is out there about works and being recognizing and not necessarily doing everything, Chris. It's not about then saying, right, I'm going to do this and that and that and that and that because all these things don't work. But it's about having a mindset which is open to the other. And I do think Roger says, when he talks about the facts are friendly, he very much says it was when we did our research, we found things out that were painful and that weren't right and that were, went against what we wanted to think. And it was an emotional effort to go, okay, but I think that kind of openness to evidence and that openness to the research is more specifically what I'm talking about in terms of kind of thinking about what therapeutic practice is.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to maybe come back to research, but I
Yeah.
just want to rewind a little bit, just in terms of, I think what's with me is about there's something in potentially what is represented in what you're talking around pluralism about the kind of fluidity in that when it's linked, particularly maybe with Rogers and the person-centered approach, it could risk speaking of improvement in a sense, in the way that does it need that link, if that makes sense? So, I think person centered would certainly talk about fluidity and many of the things that you mentioned there, and is captured within the theory. So, I think the thing that's there for me is like going back to that question around putting them together is that, person centered is representing many of those things. And so for me, I'm just wanting to really get that link with pluralism rather than it being something in its own right that is influenced by Rogers and other things. Um, can it be pluralism as in pluralism rather than person-centered pluralistic practice, if that makes sense?
I'm not totally with you, Chris. Say a bit more.
Yeah, I think I can make that simpler. What I'm talking about, I think, is why do we need to pair them? I think that's what I'm saying. Rather because it can speak of person-centered needs to be evolved or improved
Yeah.
for it to be paired with something else.
Yeah.
So what is it for pluralism to just exist in its own right
Yeah.
and person-centered to exist in its own right?
Yeah. 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 No, I get what you're saying. And I feel mixed, the honest answer is I feel mixed on that, Chris. On the one hand, I think, yeah, I absolutely think person-centered has a right to kind of have an identity and, you shouldn't be invaded by anything or taken over. And I can see why people are concerned about that. On the other hand, if you've got a philosophy of growth, if your approach is based on a philosophy of growth, which says that growth is about change and evolution and adaptation, and it's all about moving beyond the fixed construct, to then go, right, this is person centered. That's all we are. That's all we're ever going to be. It's like, yeah, it does bring out that kind of like WTF kind of response in me. It's like, how can you do that? How can you talk about, of course it's got to change. Of course it's got to grow. And we see that in the kind of policy world and the real, CBT has been so successful because it's evolved and it's grown. It's changed. It's looked at the evidence. They do studies. They look at what works. Something doesn't work. They drop it. They do something. And I just think an approach which is saying, right, we defined ourselves back in 1959, 1957. That's all we are. That's all we're going to be. We ain't changing. I, to me, that's just not, I just don't see how that can be person-centered. If that's what person-centered is, part of me goes, that is not person-centered because person-centered, surely we should be at the forefront of change and evolution and openness if that's our philosophy of being. But I know Pete Sanders would say probably, well, you can't compare a movement with a person. Growth is about the person. You can't just transpose that onto the organization and say, well, the organization should grow because people, can grow. I kind of think, yeah. So I think that's partly, and and partly, yeah, and as I say, I think pluralism did evolve to some extent. It came from person-centered, and to some extent, it did exist independently. And then it was through that article, which I wrote with John, but mainly was me saying, well, maybe we can read person-centered in this way. And I think people have said, just leave us alone. You don't need to do that. You don't need to
Yeah,
read person-centered in that way.
Yeah, yeah. So there's almost like two things going on that get put together. Is there's and I can certainly get in that discussion about the absolutism in, well, person-centered any approach in some way. So
Yeah.
it's like that is one part of it that I'm hearing from you, but then also something of like the presence and development of pluralism, which might see to that in some way. And that sounds like that's what brings the link together, is an experience of dogma or absolutism in the person-centered approach, a view to develop an approach which captures research, is evolved, and is maybe, I don't know if you're saying this, but something of like, this is what it could be, or what could happen with change and evolution in an approach.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess my vision of person-centered approach would be is a kind of multifaceted approach that really has embraces lots of practice. I mean, lot of my vision would be an approach that is well evidenced. And so, for instance, in the latest Tribes book, we've got motivational interviewing in there, which is a really well evidenced approach. And I know some people go, "Well, am I the same as person-centered?" But I think there should be space for these kind of like well evidenced approach. You got emotion focused therapy, which is quite different from a classical approach. I personally I like this idea of tribes, diversity, variation, and I'd like to think of the person-centered approach as this kind of vibrant, dynamic, multifaceted field where different approaches are talking to each other. But that's not everybody, certainly in the UK. And also I think it's important to talk about the UK international concepts. I mean, there's some places in the world like UK where person-centered classical approach does tend to dominate. You go to other places like Belgium or Ukraine, where they have a much more multifaceted sense already of what the person-centered approach is. So a lot of it does come out of this question of, when you ask, does a person-centered pluralism sit together? It depends. What do we mean by? I mean, Chris, what's your understanding? To put this back to you for a bit, what's your understanding of what the person-centered approach is, and how do you see it then fitting with pluralism?
Yeah, for me, I think I see them as separate entities. I think that's where I come from, because I think they in a sense do their own thing, and they state what they're about, and there are differences there. So for me, for the person-centered approach to kind of have a representation of its theory and its philosophy is almost like, this is what it is. We can talk about actualizing tendency, necessary and sufficient conditions, that type of thing is almost like, that is what it's about, and the philosophy that underpins it. And so then we get into this tricky thing, which I think is what you're talking about there, in this idea of like diversity. And we get to a point where it's almost like, where is the line? I think that's the important part in it. So when does something stop becoming the thing we're talking about? So I can, see many modern developments in person-centered theory, which I think are very welcome, well researched at times as well. And I can see how they fit within the core theory. And I think that's something of the kind of the test for me. And it's then when we move away from that, that it actually comes to a place where it's negating the theory. It's not just saying that it doesn't fit, it's almost saying like, that isn't non-directive, and therefore, for example, it stops becoming the thing we're talking about. So for me, that is what the distinction is about. And when things get put in with person-centered, that might actually go against many of its theories. Yeah.
But would you accept that? So that's a terrible phrase. Would you see? So it's something like focusing. Would you see that as person-centered?
I think with almost anything, and this is what Roger said as well, is it is about the attitude and the delivery. That might sound like a bit of a cop out, but I think it is so important. So it's not necessarily the thing that we are doing, but it is the attitude and the place that it comes from.
Okay.
So if it is based in the conditions, if that's where it comes from, if it is based out of respect for the client and their kind of direction and autonomy, then I can see there's room for a lot of things. I think the thing that captures this the best, I would say, probably is around the kind of principled and instrumental non-directivity. I guess that's basically what I'm saying. And I think a lot of the things that we're talking about touches on the instrumental non-directivity, which in my view then doesn't represent the person-centered approach.
So where
So
would
that
you so if somebody's introducing like say a focusing technique and saying to a client something like, well, look, there might be a useful method here, called focusing, or might not even say that, where we bring you in and focusing on your experience. Could you tell us how that could be done in a way that for you would sit within person-centered, and how it could be done in a way that wouldn't? Because I think it'd be really interesting to get a sense of what you see as that kind of boundary.
So for me, firstly, it comes from what the intention is in the therapist. Why are they introducing this? So if this is introduced in order to obtain a result or to make something happen, then I think a lot of the time that is going to go against a person-centered approach. Whereas to talk about the other side of the line, as you asked, is if a client said, do you know something that does this? For example, I'm kind of over egging the point there. Then I think I can respond within the conditions. And if I feel competent in offering focusing, then I think that is something I could offer in response to that. So I think so much of it is based in where is this coming from in the therapist and why.
Okay. So what
Yeah.
would be, so when you say where is it coming from? To go into that a bit more. So in that example, if a client is saying, do you know anything that could, I don't know, help me go deeper into my experience? If a therapist is then, say, knows focusing and draws on that or on chair work, do you, isn't that still trying to do something?
I think it's meeting the client probably primarily, and I think there is also discussion and collaboration around that. So I wouldn't just be like, right, we're doing focus and this is what's going to happen. It's almost
Yeah,
like hearing the request of the client. I think continuing to understand that as best as possible, and probably through that understanding, that might actually lead to offering something that meets the request from the client. So for me, that is an important part of it. And if the desire for something to happen, the client is saying, I want this to happen to me,
yeah,
and I'm aware of something that often
yeah,
does that, then it might be appropriate. But if a client is saying, let's say, for example, a client is saying, I just can't get in touch with my feelings. And I say, oh, well, I know this thing called focusing.
yeah.
I feel like I've jumped a million miles there and I'm being led by different desires to the conditions, I would say. I think the essence of all of this that we're talking about is that instrumental principle non-directivity. I
And
think
how
I
would
think
you
that is.
understand that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so for me, so maybe I can maybe put a link to the article for people as well by Barry Grant,
Sorry, Grant.
and it talks about the kind of attitude that the therapist has in non-directivity. So if we are instrumental in our non-directivity, then we are being non-directive in order to achieve something. And that also means that if we don't achieve that thing, we could very easily drop
Yeah,
being non-directive. And whereas if we are principled in that, we are non-directive out of a respect for the client and a view of the client that we have. And so basically that has to be based in person-centered theory a lot of the
yeah,
time, right? So we're basically saying I subscribe to this theory and I work in this way. I am non-directive out of that attitude. I'm doing this through an attitude not to cause anything, not to make you better per se. Then yeah, so for me that's the difference. Are we trying to cause something? Or are we doing it in a relational attitude
See,
based in respect?
I struggle with that distinction, Chris, and I'll tell you partly why, because I guess from an existential book or, sorry, standpoint, or like I was thinking in the book that I did about integrating counseling psychotherapy, there's a view that everything is directional. We are always trying to do something. I can't imagine ever not trying, whatever I do has a kind of intention. It's kind of the basis of phenomenology. So when you say that it's a kind of behavior. And so if we take that example of the focusing, and when it fits with person-centered in your definition and when it doesn't. For me, they're both trying to do things. I don't see this kind of clear black and white line between, this is about trying to do something to the client.
Yeah,
A client comes to therapy because they want help. So we are trying to do something to help them. And I think that is trying to do something. I don't see, and I think what pluralism is trying to be is kind of non-directive, a meta level almost, which is saying that it's kind of trying to recognize that what it is that have that conversation about what's going on at that level, because it's trying to respond in a respectful and a caring way to what the client wants. But clients do want something from therapy. They don't come to therapy
yeah.
without wants. They want something from us, and they want
I
us
get
to
that.
do something.
Yeah, yeah. I'll come back to that, but I just want to quickly go to, because the word that you use, which I think is really important in this, is intention. And I
Yeah.
totally agree with that. So, yes,
So all behavior is intentional.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. But I think what I'm saying, I feel like I'm just promoting here. The last video I did was about our intention as counselors. So you can watch that if you want. But the intention, yes, I totally agree. But for a person-centered counselor, I think the intention is to be offering those conditions and be as authentic as I can, as opposed to an intention as I want to fix you. And I'm kind of again over egging the point to make the
Okay.
point.
So if
But
you knew, but Chris, if you knew that doing those conditions wasn't going to be helpful for a client, see, I think this is where pluralism and maybe person-centered does divert. Because from a pluralistic perspective, the main goal is to help the client. And there's a recognition that there might be multiple ways of doing that. But if you were to say, right, actually my foremost goal is to do these conditions, whether or not they're helpful, I don't care whether they're helpful or not. My foremost goal is to do these conditions. Then to, to me that doesn't feel person-centered, because person-centered means about putting the client's wants first. That feels about putting my technique and my beliefs before the client and what they can get out. And that's where I think a critique of person-centered from pluralism comes from. It's like, seriously, are you just concerned about your technique? Do you seriously think your technique and your methods are more of a concern than the client?
yeah, I don't think it would be at a point where I'm saying like I'm doing this whatever. It almost sounds like you've got to sit there and I'm going to offer
Yeah,
you the
well, you're saying
conditions
that
that
the
I'm. Yeah,
sorry.
I just want to finish that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Um, it's okay. I think there's something for me in I have to start from a belief and a place of practice, and I think with person centered for myself, that feels like it is a good fit. I feel like I know it well, I understand it well, I practice it at varying degrees depending on how I'm doing. Um, but for me, it's like I've got to come from somewhere. And if I'm clear about what I'm offering and I'm collaborative with the client, and that is the point at which I'm practicing from to try and offer those conditions as best I can, I don't think it's as rigid as if this isn't working for you, sit there because it's going to work eventually. It's nothing like that. It's like the conditions also hold a space for you're not getting much from this, it seems, or you're getting angry that you're not getting the results, or whatever it might be. So I don't want it to be seen as like the conditions happen to someone. I think it's an attitudinal thing that we bring into that place, and that also holds being empathic and accepting of the client's experience of it, I think, rather than it being I'm person centered, this is what I'm doing, that's it. It
Well,
takes out the kind of relational and the movement in that
yeah.
experience.
But the paradox for me is that it feels like the focus on the core conditions as the be all and end all actually becomes unrelational, because it becomes about the core condition. I mean, my understanding of what you're saying is person-centered to the extent that the focus, the intentionality is on the core conditions. So say you've got this person-centered approach where you've got this focus on the core conditions. And what we're saying is the pluralistic approach is the focus on the client and the client's well-being. And that's where I kind of feel that person-centered and is more interested in its kind of theory and its kind of methodology, rather than actually what's helpful or not for the client. I mean, when we were doing the research on counselling in schools, we found, and this is with well-trained, these were well-trained counselors who I had a lot of respect for. Um, in about 30% of the cases, the kids were saying that they wanted more input from the counselors. And we've analyzed that. We didn't go into it looking for it, but that's what we found. Um, I think there is, if we think about the client and if we think about the client rather than the core conditions, there are a number of instances clearly from young people's perspective. And again, I guess, if I'm honest, I'm more interested in young people's perspectives than I am in what Carl Rogers said. I want to hear the voice of young people. And if young people are saying this isn't working for me, that takes priority over what Carl Rogers said is necessary and sufficient in 1957. And, and so when you say, or when person-centered people say, no, person-centered is about the core conditions, part of me, again, it brings up for me a kind of mixed feeling because part of me goes, okay, that, like we can go off, take pluralism about the clients, about respecting the client, hearing the client's voice. That's what we're going to focus on. We don't need to get involved. And certainly a lot of people in the pluralistic world say that. They say to me, like, why are you getting involved in these discussions? Just, let's just focus on pluralism. But then the other part of me goes, is it really, is that really what it means to be person-centered? Is to put and is to privilege our methods
Mm.
over the client's well-being? Do we really think that Rogers' voice will? Chris, I don't think. I think if I asked you that question, whose voice do you think is more important, the voice of the young clients or what Carl Rogers said in 1957?
That is a tough question because I think they both have a place. But
Is that a
I
stupid
just want to come.
question?
I don't think it's a stupid question, but I don't. I. It's a hard one to answer because I think there is value in. It's basically every person's experience, right, and view. That's
Yeah,
what we're working off. What I want to go back to, because I think it's a really important distinction, is what you're talking about there about the core conditions. That's not how I relate to it myself. I don't think, I know I was talking through the six necessary and sufficient conditions as an example then, but it's not just that is the theory, that's all I do. For me, the conditions have come out of a theory of personality, right? About how people operate, about what a person-centered therapist believes to be helpful for someone or believes is a climate that a person can use. So I don't see it as separate as this is not about the client, this is not about people, it's just the conditions. I don't see it like that. If we're talking about research as well, and of course I get your point about, I guess, updating research, things like that. But the person-centered is the first based in that, so
absolutely.
it's like it's come out of that. So I'm not saying that there isn't an argument for development. I'm not saying that at all. But yeah, I don't think it's fair to say it's just offering the core conditions. That's all person-centered practitioners are
No,
bothered about. It's like that's based in theory of personality and with a view to support people.
but it was. I mean, when Rogers did that, it was a tentative hypothesis based on, as you say, the research. So for that to become a kind of fixed, you're saying that the definition of person-centered is about the core conditions.
I don't think I am
No.
saying that.
Well,
No.
okay. So what would you so go because I guess what I'm still trying to understand is what you see as that dividing line between what is person-centered and what isn't. And when we were looking at you saying the intention of in person-centered is towards those conditions, whereas the intention in non-person-centered is towards doing something. And I guess I challenge that distinction because I don't think, for me, if the intention is just towards the core conditions, that feels to me very therapist centered. But maybe there's a different way that you can define it that can help me understand what is a meaningful definition and a person centered.
Yeah. I'm trying to think because I'm tempted to go back to that instrumental in principle because I think that does capture it so
Yeah,
well.
but what does it mean?
So the idea of that is that if we are being instrumental,
Yeah.
then we are being non-directive insofar as it creates change. And therefore, if it isn't doing that, we can drop it, which obviously doesn't fit with person-centered theory. And then if we look at the principled idea of that, or maybe to take it away a bit from that to make it a bit more broad, is I think it's about the beliefs and the attitudes that are offered to the client with a view that is a facilitative space
Okay.
for them to explore
Okay.
their experience. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So we say that being person-centered is something about the beliefs and attitudes. The therapist holds a particular sense of belief and attitudes that creates a facilitative space. So what makes those beliefs? I guess I'm trying to say, because we're going back to this question, is pluralistic and person-centered different? What would you say those beliefs and attitudes are from a person-centered standpoint?
I think the important elements of it, I think actualizing tendency is a
Which you mean
really,
by what?
in terms of the kind of motivational force in a person that is basically directing, I mean, all of their behavior is the theory. So I think that is central. For me, it's almost like building blocks to see the actualizing tendency as such a central belief about, well, organisms or people in that. I think it then leads on to, and if that's the case,
Okay,
what
but
is the most.
sorry, Chris, just to bring you back a look, when you say the actualizing sense, so you're saying there's a motivating force. Okay. So there's lots of different theories of motivation. When you say motivating force, what kind of motivating force, or what makes that particularly person-centered?
Hmm, I'm just trying to make sense of that in terms of like making sure I understand it right. I guess what makes it person-centered is it kind of came out of Roger's theory, this idea of the actualizing tendency. Um, is that how you meant it, or did you mean that in a
Just to
different way?
understand, so the idea, I just want to understand in a bit more detail what you mean by a motivating force, like motivated to do what, how
Well,
would you
everything,
understand that?
every single thing we do is driven by that.
Okay,
Is
but
is the
what is it?
belief.
What is it? I mean, there's lots of theories in psychology that would say that people are fundamentally motivated, intentional or directional. Um, what's person-centered saying that's different from lots of other theories?
Oh, that feels a slightly different question now if we're talking about difference.
Well, okay,
I
so
just want to
no, but
try and
what's
get to
the,
the crux of what
yeah.
you're
I guess I'm
trying to
just
get
trying to
there.
understand like how you define. I mean, okay, so Rogers 1957, 59, sorry. The actualizing tendency is that there's a motivating force within the individual that strives to maintain and enhance all its capabilities. Yeah. Would you go
Their
with that or
experience. Yeah, their experience, because I think that's really important because often it gets kind of put in with positive behavior. And I think that's a misunderstanding often.
yeah, of
So
course.
it's, yeah, enhance experience, whatever that might be and why ever that might be.
Okay. So you'd have an idea that the person is always striving to maintain and enhance their being. Yeah.
Their experience. Yeah, I guess you can.
In
Yeah,
from
yeah.
their experiential field. Okay. So I mean I totally agree with that. I mean I would share that. Do you think that that means that people always do the right thing?
Well, that's a big question because then we have to define right and wrong, don't we?
Do you think the person always does the thing that's most helpful for them? I mean, do you think the person always so we'd agree, I think, that the person strives to maintain and enhance their being in their experiential field. In their experiencing, what they're trying to do is maintain and enhance their being. Yeah, or would you see it slightly different?
Yes, it's that the experience thing is so important, right? So, like an example we often give is that if someone is in kind of deep distress or agony,
Yeah.
or let's say, or experiencing PTSD or something like that, then to get drunk would be an action of the actualizing tendency. And I think often that is what can be missed in that. So for me, it's like that's where it gets difficult if we bring in right or wrong, because there's lots of different views on that. But for me, it's an expression of the organism is like, this is the best I can do right now to enhance my experience
Okay.
in this
Yeah,
moment.
the person is always striving to do their best. Yeah.
I, I, yeah, yeah.
Well,
I think so. I don't, it just gets tricky with some of this. It's just semantics. I'm just getting caught up on
well, how would
semantics.
you
But
so how would you define it, Chris? Because those are
I
my
think it is enhancing their experience. I think it's just a crucial way to define
okay.
that.
But how when you say
The,
enhancing their experience, what does that mean?
well, I guess it's something of like that example I gave is almost like when the person is experiencing something that is so difficult, then they are going to a place of like what will kind of enhance this in the moment? What will take that pain away? This is a thing that I know does that. And so me as an organism is going to move towards that in order to change and enhance this experience so that it is less distressing in this moment.
Say that again. So with the example of alcohol, yeah. So somebody's saying, right, so somebody's sitting there, they're anxious and they're thinking, right, I need to have a drink. So you're saying that that's an expression of the actualizing tendency. Yeah. Okay. How, where's so the person is striving to enhance. What are they striving to enhance?
Their experience in
So
that
they're
moment
striving
as an
to,
experiencing
okay.
organism.
So they're striving to enhance their experiencing. Do you do you think the person always does enhance their experiencing?
I think in their field, yes, I think they do what they can to enhance it as best they can in that moment.
Okay,
Yes.
but do you think that they always do? I mean, they strive to do. So there's a difference between the kind of intention and the effect. People strive to enhance. I mean, I agree with you absolutely that somebody, goes for a drink is striving to enhance their experience. It's a really nice way you put it. But do you think that they always do enhance their experiencing?
Are you maybe getting towards a kind of objective view of that, or like let's actually maybe to put it better is like a well-being point of view? Is it something like that that
Well,
you're
I think
wondering
no.
about?
I mean, I'm happy to stay with the kind of phenomenological bit of it. It's like what you're saying is that the person strives to enhance their experiencing. Yeah. I guess when we're thinking about therapeutic practices, okay, so this might be complicated, but let me try and articulate it. Somebody comes to you and they say, right, I want to enhance my, in very abstract terms, they say, I want to enhance my experience. I want to be happier. Yeah. Things to be better. I want to enhance my experiencing. So that's at one level. And then they talk about, and we would both agree that that's an expression of the actualizing tendency. Yeah, absolutely. So then somebody talks and they talk about they drink and they get really drunk and we both would say, that that's also about them striving to enhance their experiencing. Now, supposing that they also say, and I have these awful headaches and I get the worst hangovers and it's really awful for me. Um, and again, I'm sure we both say that's about them striving to enhance their experiencing. I guess what I'm wondering about, and the way that I would see it is that sometimes people striving to enhance their experiences can be in tension, can be in conflict. And that, for instance, what the actualizing tendency is striving to do at the beginning and saying, I want to stop feeling terrible about myself, for instance, is in tension with the actualizing tendency, which is I'm going to drink this bottle and get as drunk as I can.
Yeah. I mean,
And
we're
I
getting
guess
to the
so.
core. Sorry, I was just going to say quickly there
Yeah,
because I think it's really relevant. We're getting to that the core person-centered theory there about psychological tension. I guess that's what we're talking about is the conflict between the self-concept and the kind of organismic valuing process there is that they're often going in different directions
yeah.
and that's what causes difficulty, you know?
But maybe where we would disagree is that I would say that the organismic value and processing itself can sometimes pull in different directions.
Hmm. I might need a while if I was to think about that. It's an interesting point, but I don't want to get us lost because I'm thinking about that. I suppose we have different congruent experiences at different times, which could lead to that potentially. Um, Maybe we're going to go down a rabbit hole that we're going to lose lose the way. Sorry, I
Everyone.
feel like I interrupted to do that because that theory felt relevant. But anyway, so
Yeah,
with
no,
that
I think
client,
I think it's relevant in the sense of my question about well, it comes in. I mean, I think it's really cool to practice because then let's take a question like, is it person-centered to give advice? Is it person-centered to say something like, let's have a look at your drinking, say like in motivational interview, let's have a look at your drinking, how much you're drinking. Let's, somebody maybe doesn't know what that's doing to their body. Somebody maybe doesn't know that that leads to really bad kind of more depression. Yeah, take that as an example. So if you hold the position if you're understanding, I mean, I guess why I'm drilling down into this concept of actualizing tendencies because I don't think it's self-evident. I think it's a really complex concept, which I would kind of, and maybe this is where our discussion will go because I think people often say it like everybody knows what it means. And I think students often feel like, trainers talk about actualizing tendency, and if they don't get it, then there's something wrong with them. And actually, I think it's a complex term that I don't think, totally hang together. Um, or I think it needs to be understood in certain ways. Because, if we take something about, is it person-centered to give somebody advice, then it's partly dependent on whether we understand that there's a kind of, the actualizing tendency is always congruent, it's always going in the same direction. And that when somebody's saying that they want help, and when somebody's drinking, and when somebody's kind of getting a hangover, this is all part of one consistent, unified stream. And then maybe what's upsetting it is these conditions of worth. And if you strip away the conditions of worth, then everything will be okay. And if you work in a non-directive way, you allow the client to come back into their organismic value and potential, then there won't be an issue between tensions because everything is consistent. But if, on the other hand, you hold, and I guess it's a bit more existential, that there are certain given tensions between, say, the desire for relatedness and the desire for autonomy, the desire for pleasure versus the desire for meaning. If we're understanding of the actualizing tendency is more that there is this kind of, we strive at all times to do what's maintaining and enhancing, but at different points we understand it in different ways. And sometimes, like, I mean, this is what I've written about in my book about integrating psychotherapy, is this idea that these things are often in tension, and not, one of those tensions is definitely about wanting to be liked by others. But I don't think that's the only tension. And even if, in a sense, I think one of the reasons the actualizing tendency hits problems is because it doesn't explain where the self-actualizing tendency comes from. Like, why do we want to be liked by others? I think, my sense is we have to understand that as part of the actualizing tendency. So in that sense, it is inevitably in conflict. In, any situation is going to be particular conflict. But if we understand it is in conflict, then I think it brings up the question of, is there more role for the therapist? There's a psychoeducation, initiating staff, challenging contradictions, bringing in different methods, and all these things that are part of pluralism, rather than what you might see as a more purist person-centered approach in the name, in terms, and that these things are all consistent with person-centered theory. So I think, the kind of position you're outlining as person-centered requires an understanding of the actualizing tendency as consistent, whole, and non-contradictory. And I would challenge that.
I'm not sure that's what I'm saying because I think it is in the theory that the actualizing tendency, in a sense, is driving conflictual processes all the
Yeah,
time.
I agree.
Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
agree.
So I'm on board with that for sure. I mean, it feels like such a core element of what we're doing
Yeah,
as person-centered therapists, in a sense, is that the reason our people are experiencing whatever they are experiencing, particularly if it's distress, is because of that conflict. Like everything comes down to that, and the actualizing tendency is present in every single behavior. So I don't know if I see a problem with the actualizing tendency and what you represent
so
there.
if a
It
client
feels
comes,
like I was just going to say what's funny in it is that it's like it feels very person-centered what you're saying, in a way, like the theory that you're coming to in that, I think, is represented in the approach.
so what happens, I mean, if a client comes to you and says, like, I really value your advice, I really value your opinion on this, would you share it?
It depends what it was about and what my kind of response was, because if a client says something like, this is the situation, what should I do, it's unlikely that I'll know the right
Sure.
thing to do or the outcome. But if a client says, I've been experiencing this, do you know some ways that help you relax? Sure. Like if I know some, then I'll share them, so it doesn't feel like I mean, maybe to go back to what we were talking about before, I don't want it to be dogmatic of like, I can never give advice. But I think it goes back again to what we were saying about it's all about intention and attitude. Like, what is underpinning your practice? what is your philosophy and your theory.
Yeah, but I just don't get. I know you're saying that, Chris, but I don't get the distinction. I don't get I don't get the distinction of what you're saying is what makes it one and not the other. Because I think
Because
that, okay, so you might say, well, okay, so the distinction is, some therapists might say, well, look, if you're stressed, this is what you should do. Whereas I'm just responding to the client. But I think it's a very subtle distinction. I mean, what if a client is really, supposing I mean, relaxation methods, supposing a client is talking about being really stressed, really anxious, they're saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know any relaxation methods, but doesn't actually say, can you tell me something? Would you then share?
um, I think it, I think it may get, yeah, I think I might say something about that, but I think my primary point there is to meet them in their experience. It may be something that I offer in terms of like, this sometimes is helpful. I don't know if it would be any use to you. That might come out. I don't want to feel fixed in like I can or I can't. But I think what I'm saying is the reason I keep coming back to intention, I think, is because that decides how we relate to those things. So let's say, with that example, a client is discussing that, saying, I'm so stressed, I don't know any relaxation techniques. Because of my intention, I think, as a person centered counselor, my primary thing is to meet them in that with those
I
conditions.
think you're trying to help them, Chris.
Well, I'm not saying I'm not either, but I'm just saying that that's the intention. The reason I keep coming back to intention is like that is what is deciding how I'm meeting someone, how I'm responding to them, what my attitude is in relationship to another, and why I have that and why I hold that. I think that's what
I mean,
is
I
there.
guess as a practitioner, I'm thinking what's helpful here, not what's person-centered.
I think that's what I'm saying about intention. That's exactly my point.
So
Is
would you
that
say that in your practice, you're thinking, would you accept that the difference maybe between us is that I'm thinking what's helpful here and you're thinking what's person-centered here? I don't think you'd agree with that. That doesn't sound ethical.
I think then we get into something that's what's helpful. Again, I mean, there's lots
Yeah.
of avenues we can go here about how we define helpful. Um,
Well, I define
but
it as what the client experiences and identifies as helpful.
yes, but I guess in some instances, therapists will be deciding that for the client. Deciding
Yeah.
or saying, I think this will be helpful for you, or this is what I believe should be done to exaggerate it. Um, so I think it's the point we're talking about is the point. I think it's really important. And I do think the difference is you might be coming from what is most helpful for this client. And I think I am coming from what attitudes do I bring to this relationship? And that is based in a kind of view of what I believe is helpful, and what the person centered approach represents. So you could say there's similarity there, but I think it comes into potentially the kind of expert thing about who do we see as the expert? How
Yeah.
do we best represent and facilitate that? So I think we are saying the same thing, but I think it is the difference between us is like how we decide what is helpful for the client and what kind of attitude underpins that, and yeah, what helpful is and what we believe about, I guess, the use and power of
Yeah.
relationship in that too.
I mean, I'm aware we need to finish in a few minutes, Chris. I mean, what it brings up for me actually is a sadness when you say that, because it seems to me, if I'm working with clients, the most person-centered, humanistic, ethical question should be what's going to be helpful for this person here. Um,
I agree with
that's
that.
really putting the client at the center of it and saying, how can I be most helpful? Put my theories to one side, my dogma to one side, my beliefs to one side. I obviously can't do that 100%. But as much as possible, can I bracket my assumptions and my biases so that I can really try and ask the question, what is most helpful to the client here? And I think, in the pluralistic approach, that's really what we've tried to do, or really try and put center. I think if you're saying, well, okay, but in the person-centered approach, what we do is we say, what is relational here, or, what is person-centered here? I kind of accept that, and I can kind of accept that that's maybe a difference. I just I feel I feel sad for the person-centered approach there, and I feel sad for where the person-centered approach is going to go. Because if you look at commissioners and funders, their question is not what's most relational, what do Carl Rogers say in 1957? Their question is what's most helpful, however they understand that. If you ask clients, what do they want? Clients don't come to therapy saying they want a relationship or want a relational condition. They don't say, what I really want in therapy is, the congruence of the therapist. What they say is, I want to get better, I want to improve, I want to change. And I can accept kind of your definition of and where you're understanding person-centered, but to me, there's a real risk that that understanding of it just sidelines it. And whereas things like CBT and ACT and DBT and all these approaches are saying, what can we do for clients that is really going to be helpful, which for me is the most motivating, energizing question. I worry that the person-centered world is going off and saying, well, what is person-centered and what does person-centered mean and how would you define the instrument? It feels like it's just going to go down some very dark alley that it just won't ever come back from.
Yeah, I think if that's the conclusion, maybe I've misrepresented what I'm trying to say because that's not where I'm coming from. That it is just about me being person-centered and just being doing theory for the sake of it. I think the thing that I value in it so much is it is based in the uniqueness of the client and their experience. And that I think is why those conditions are so important to be able to understand those things. So for me, it's almost like it's the opposite of what you're saying is like the approach creates a space that kind of values and holds the unique experience of each person that comes to therapy, but maybe I've just misrepresented it or miscommunicated it in how I'm saying about the importance and the presence of the conditions because I'm not saying it from a dogmatic point of view saying
No, I
this
hear
is
that,
what I
Chris.
do to clients for the sake of it. It's like that's what I think best facilitates another person and their autonomy.
Yeah. But
So it's
then,
ultimately not about me, you know.
yeah, but then I think
Mm.
if you're saying that I'm doing that because it best facilitates, you're doing something just like a CBT therapist is, just like a psychodynamic therapist is.
I
So I don't
mm.
think the distinction is in terms of the intention. I think, I think that for me, what I'd like to think makes something really person-centered is that it's really deeply trying to do someone for that unique individual in front of us. And if that is intentional to help somebody, I'm not, I'm not ashamed of that. And I think if you're saying, well, the difference is that pluralistic might be trying to do things to help people, but we're not interested in that. I don't know
Mm.
where does that take the person-centered world? It feels quite kind of, I don't want to use the word narcissistic, but it feels like it's going away from the client rather than towards the client. It feels like it's therapist centered, not client centered.
I can understand that. I don't think it's how I'm trying to represent it in terms of like what's helpful. I think the maybe the crux of this kind of discussion in some ways like how we define helpful and who we believe has the answer to what is helpful, I think is more what it's about because I don't think I'm saying anything about like I don't want to be helpful. I think what's important to me is like the intention and the attitude that is underpinning what I'm doing. And that isn't to say it's about me, it's because those things are based on what I want to be able to, I guess, connect with, to understand, to facilitate for another person and their individual experience, rather than it's like I do the conditions because that's what I do, like it or lump it. That's not where I'm coming from. So yeah, I wonder if there's like a semantic thing, or I think we're closer than we think. I think there definitely is a distinction between person-centered and other approaches for sure. But I think, yeah, there's I think we're maybe closer than we think in understanding that or being able to differentiate between what it is that is different in how we approach work as a therapist.
Part three to come. I think we have to carry on. And
Yeah,
what I'd love to know, Chris, I mean, maybe part three will begin by trying to, I think that, where we're getting to for me, which is really helpful, is trying to clarify what is person-centered. What do we mean by it? And I think that's really fruitful line of inquiry, really. Like what does it mean? Because I think without answering that question, we can't really say, does pluralism sit with it? Doesn't it sit with it? I
Yeah,
let's do part three. I really enjoy that, and I really
yeah,
appreciate your openness and you're willing to talk about this and kind of engage in dialogue and just sit in the kind of unknown and try and work these things out because
yeah.
I don't, I certainly don't know the answers.
No, likewise, and I really appreciated. Yeah, it feels like I've just realized we're like a million miles away from where we started, but I appreciated, yeah, you sharing more of yourself and your journey, I think, as part of this too. Yeah, and I was just thinking as well for a part three, I think it'd be really helpful to see how people respond as well. Like what questions do they have in this?
Yeah,
How do they view this? Yeah, certainly some greater minds than me that can probably represent the approach better as well. But I think that might be a really good way to gather how it's being received and where we
yeah,
go from here. But I've
brilliant.
I've really valued it. Yeah, thank you,
All
mate.
right.
Cheers, Mick.
Cheers, Chris.